One of the reasons in the United States why the interest in true crime really just grew was in the 1990s when OJ Simpson went on trial.
How many people could have spent time in jail? Go back 50 years, go back 60 years before all this technology came into play, based on the circumstantial evidence. It's quite frightening.
So I felt that I could accomplish more as a journalist than I could as a lawyer in making a difference in people's lives, in informing jurors.
The I Catch Killers podcast was a fresh start for me, as I left policing behind and started a new life. Over the years, we've laughed together, cried, and shared some powerful moments. Welcome to I Catch Killers. Welcome to another episode of I Catch Killers. Anyone who has a passing interest in the world of crime knows that the crime in America eclipses what we see in this country. Well, today we're going to explore crime in America from someone who has been covering it for the past 30 years. We're talking to an award-winning journalist, Erin Moriarty, who has covered some of the biggest cases in America. Mass shootings, serial killings, wrongful convictions. Erin has seen it all. Not only is she a journalist, she's also a lawyer, and she has a degree in behavioural science. And for the past 3 decades, in her role as a CBS News journalist, she's been a reporter on the highly successful 48 Hours television program. She's won multiple Emmy Awards and is the host of the true crime podcast, My Life of Crime. So we've certainly got a lot to talk about. Erin Moriarty, welcome to I Catch Killers.
I'm very happy to be here.
I think it's I'm excited too. I really am. We look at crime in our country, and what I said in that introduction, that seeing what goes on in America, it sort of eclipses what we've got. It's on a magnitude that we don't see, generally speaking. Here in Australia, we have an insatiable appetite for true crime. And what's your take on it? Is that the same in America?
Oh, without question. It's interesting that you bring up the differences between Australia and the United States in terms of crime, but that's really true of most countries. Back in 1991, we even decided to take a look at London. We were doing a 48 hours. We did a full hour of crime in New York and crime in London. The cities are almost the identical size. But we had 2,100 murders just in New York City that year, and they had 200. And so when you had two cities of 8 million people, you're wondering what's the differences. And of course, the answer,
Yeah.
I'm simplifying, but does come down a lot to the access to guns. But there has been a growing interest in true crime. And I think I know where it really started, but to be honest, and I know you know this, Gary, our parents were reading murder mysteries. So there's always been an interest in murder mysteries. But now I think there's an interest in the legal system and in capturing criminals, as well as just the story behind it.
I think that's reasonable because people get a deeper view of crime in the way it's covered in this day and age. From before it be the headline on the paper, and that's basically all you got to see about the crime. Then shows like your 48 Hours and other crime shows delve a little bit deeper, and I think all of us have that budding detective in us. All of us want to solve. I think it's human nature. You want to solve mysteries, and you're curious about what happens. I also think that it's a world that a lot of people don't get to see, and that curiosity comes in there as well.
I think it's that, but I also think, particularly the kinds of crimes that most people focus on, involve what we would normally say is ordinary people. But either they're doing extraordinary things. You have an ordinary person thinking he or she's going to get away with murder, or you have individuals who are subjected to some terrible crime, like, as you mentioned, mass shootings. And we're always interested on how people who look and sound and live like ourselves have to deal with, I guess, such grief or tragedy.
Yeah, it's there was something that you said in an interview. I was just in the research preparing for the podcast, and I just read it out because it really resonated with me, and I think it's interesting the amount of crime that you've covered and your perspective on it. Can I just read out a quote and then we'll discuss this. So this was in an article. I never focus on the negative or sometimes the evil that we encounter. I always focus on the heroics. And in addition to that, what is interesting in the worst times of people's lives, whether they are charged with a crime or a victim of crime, it seems to bring out the best of them. Do you want to talk us through that? That's quotes from an article.
And I feel very strongly about that. That is the only way I've been able to do it for as long as I have. I think that really starts with the fact that I'm a lawyer and I often look at these cases from a legal perspective. But when I focus on a story, I either look for some very interesting legal issue that we haven't seen before, or as I've mentioned in the past, I did a story in Green Bay, Wisconsin, a really small town, but they had this very, I would say, progressive detective unit in the county police. And there was a young woman who disappeared and then was found dead in a field. And she was having difficulties with her boyfriend, and her boyfriend was a perfect suspect. A perfect suspect. They had fought. She had sent him angry texts. He had told his mother he wanted to be out of the relationship. Get this, Gary, there was blood found outside, her blood found outside his house.
Yeah.
And so he was arrested, but he wasn't charged because these two investigators were, as I said, progressive, and they noticed he was wearing a Fitbit. And he also had a progressive GPS on his car.
Yeah.
And there wasn't the movement. He could not have taken the body there. So even though everything in their gut said, oh, this guy probably did it, they held off. And you know what? It was a drifter. It was a drifter who he had been taking her home, and he killed her right outside her front door, basically, which explained the blood out there, and then drove her body 3 miles away. And there's a fascinating story of how they even tracked him down. But I wanted to do that story because these two detectives did not take the easy way out.
Yeah.
Their instincts, when they saw that Fitbit, there's something we don't know here. And then I heard later on, after we aired that hour, that there were other departments looking at that and wanting to know more about the Google dashboard, the Fitbit, the GPS on Progressive, the insurance Progressive company GPS that they put on cars. And so that's what I like to focus on.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I spent like 34 years in the police, and 25 of those years I was in homicide. So I've been there, done that, and seen those type of investigations. And the way you describe that, it's sort of I'm getting goosebumps from a detective's point of view. Okay, well, that's certainly worth looking at. But I've had situations like that, and we're going to talk later on about wrongful convictions because I'm very interested in that. But there was a case I was working on that an elderly lady was murdered in her home and sexually assaulted. And we had a very good suspect. And I won't go into all the details, but it was a person that was seen running from the scene, a person who had ingratiated himself into the community with the elderly, attended the same church as the victim, which was a small insular group. So there was a link to the victim. He was seen running away from the scene. When we interviewed him, he said, "Oh, my dog got off the leash," and he just came up with this bizarre story that did not make sense. He had a history of sexually assaulting elderly ladies. For all intents and purposes, he was our man. This was in the very early days of DNA. And myself and my partner, we've got this, okay, what's this DNA stuff? We know who the suspect is. We got DNA because there was semen left at the scene. The DNA report came back and said, no, it's not him. We're looking at this piece of paper, the results of the DNA tests, going, that can't be right. But it was right, and we eventually caught the right person, and this person that we had as a suspect was just a bizarre human being, and all sorts of things that he's been involved in, but he wasn't good for the murder.
But Gary, what if there hadn't been DNA?
Erin,
That's what's so interesting about this.
Erin, that's I think, and it was early in my career, that helped me realise that you've got to be so careful. Because if I would have stated my life on the fact this is a person guilty, if he was convicted, I'd think we had a righteous conviction. The story that you just talked about with the GPS and all the technology that come into play, it just made, as you were saying that and thinking about the story I just relayed, it makes me think how many people could have spent time in jail. Go back 50 years, go back 60 years before all this technology came into play, based on circumstantial evidence. It's quite frightening, isn't it?
Well, Gary, that's exactly what I asked these detectives. I said, all right, 20 years ago, before we had any kind of this forensic technology, would his name was David, would David have been arrested and charged? And they said yes. And I said, is it likely he would have been convicted? And they both just sat there and they said, yes, because he was the perfect suspect. And so that to me, I mean, see, I really was looking forward to talking with you because I wonder if sometimes we have a different perspective for two reasons. One, of course, the Australian law is more common law based,
Yeah,
it's the British law,
yeah, very much
while
so.
the American system of justice focuses more on the defendant and defendant's rights. And so, as a lawyer, I often look at the case and I'm saying, are we really sure this guy did it, even if he's been charged and there's a lot of evidence? While I think uh, an investigator is looking, this is the guy, and I've got to build up the evidence to prove it.
Yeah.
I believe it's him, and I need to build up the evidence to show it's him.
There's that group think and tunnel vision that you see on investigations, and the pressure comes with the media coverage, the victim's family, everything, high profile cases, and you've got to be careful. And I was fortunate enough to be mentored by people that I respected, that had integrity, had a good moral compass, and they always cautioned that okay, group think, but let's think outside the square a little bit. And some very good detectives taught me that even if you think, okay, we've got enough to charge this person, we've got enough to put this person before court, let's just try and dissect what we've got and see if we can break it down before we get to that point. Like, see if there's a weakness in the case and see if we're missing something. But the stakes are high, aren't they, when you're talking about taking away someone's liberty? And I know in the US, like the death penalty still in play and people on death row, you got to make sure you get it right.
Well, and I mean, there's no question, but I think in some ways, life without parole is equally as bad. And one of the things, and we can talk about wrongful convictions a little later,
Yeah.
but one of the things when I talk about in the early 1990s, when we looked at this high murder rate in New York, it wasn't just New York, it was also St. Louis and Los Angeles. And there was a real push to make arrests on murders. And if you happen to be poor and you didn't have the money for an attorney and you happen to live in the wrong neighborhood, usually primarily a Black neighborhood, then there was just a rush to get these individuals charged, arrested, and sent away and move on to the next. It was almost assembly line, and I see it over and over again. But it's usually involving it. The crimes happened in the late 80s and 90s when the murder rate was really high, and these are usually people. The defendants are usually people of color without any kind of resources.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I was going to say to you, Gary, I think one of the reasons in the United States why the interest in true crime really just grew was in the 1990s when OJ Simpson went on trial.
Yeah,
because that was really one of the first cases. I mean, everybody in this country, I'm exaggerating, but a lot of people in this country would watch that daily, gavel to gavel coverage.
Yep.
And this involved a guy that we all thought we knew because he did so many commercials and he had played football, American football. And all of a sudden he's charged with a crime, that no, there's no way this individual could do it. And he runs away at some point and there's a car chase. It was the most
Oh,
entertaining television ever.
we were
And
watching the
I
car chase live over here. Like we would
exactly,
remember it. Yeah.
exactly. And I think that was for two reasons. That was the beginning of a real hunger for this kind of story. But also, that was one of the first times DNA was used in a high profile case. And after that, we started seeing, oh, so DNA shows this guy didn't do it, but he's been in for 30 years. Why did that happen? Because maybe coerced confession, or so all of a sudden we're realizing, oh, we thought the system worked so well. We thought jurors, 12 people, your peers can really cut through and see whether you're
Yeah.
innocent or guilty. All of a sudden, that's not true. So now we have all these news stories. That's really where when I started, I had all these great stories no one else really wanted to cover because they were all from a legal point of view,
Yeah.
and they were fascinating stories.
Yeah, I can understand your interest in exploring that. The a comment that you made about seeing the good in people. People often say to me about homicide. How did you last so long? Why didn't it wear you down? But I like your comments there. That at the worst time in the people's lives, the dignity. I'm talking, say, the victims' families here. The dignity they display and the humanity and the kindness. It nourishes me. That's you've got to find when you're looking at the dark world. You've got to find some brightness in there. And those quotes that I read out, it tells me that's what you saw in these situations.
Well, particularly, and the victims are the ones I think I connect to the most in all of these cases because for two, you really want them to have justice for the person they loved and lost. But you also want to make sure they have justice for the one they loved and lost and not the wrong person being arrested. And so you're kind of driven because you see what they're going through. I don't know about you, but sometimes, I mean, I'm a parent,
Mm.
and when I see parents who've lost kids, I don't know how they get up in the morning, and that energizes me more. I know that you
Yeah,
cared very deeply about a story I read. I did my research about you too, Gary,
yeah,
and I know that when a young 3-year-old disappeared,
yeah.
that became an important case to you, and I think that's also what keeps you and I interested in this, in the sense that maybe we can give them some comfort. You know, not only will there's two ways I think we help victims. Sometimes they have people in their family going, you got to move on. You can't
Yeah,
constantly talk about this. And then you get you and me, we're really interested. And we're not saying, oh, well, when I lost, we're saying, tell me more,
yeah,
tell me more. Um, and I think that's it. And then when I have wrongfully convicted defendants, they may not get out. I mean, I'm not a judge.
yeah.
I'm not a practicing lawyer, so I can't get them out. But the fact that I'm listening to their story and I'm putting it on national television and I'm letting other people have doubts about their guilt, that's giving them something as well.
Most definitely. I think the cruelest thing for victims where they think their loved one's been forgotten, and I've heard politicians say to victims' families that oh, it's time you move on, and like that's you don't say that to a victim's family. Like build a bridge, get over it. It was a historical murder, but 3 children that were murdered all known to each other, 3 Aboriginal children, and the investigation was botched from the start for a whole range of reasons, and racism did play a part in that. But where a politician told the family members at a meeting, 20 years down the track, it's time you move on. But people don't move on. But I think the important thing that you bring to a family, knowing that someone cares, and sometimes I can't get justice for the families, but they know you actually care, and that's an important thing too.
Or when we, for many years, since early 2011, we started covering the victims of the person who is known as the Long Island serial killer.
Right.
There was a suspect arrested this year, Rex Heuermann, And early on, none of the other shows wanted to cover it because the victims, as you and I both know, often the victims of serial killers are sex workers
Yeah.
or, women who are not quite on, they're not working regular jobs. That's how they are vulnerable.
Yes.
They might use burner phones and they don't tell their families what they're doing. And so it's easy for them to
Yeah.
disappear. Um, and we decided we were just going to cover that story from their perspective. And I actually was surprised with how wonderful, isn't that terrible to say, but
Yeah.
they just had the most wonderful families, and they made these victims come alive in ways that we just had not done. And I was so glad we did that, because then of course then you're driven to get justice and you're driven to keep doing the story, because in that case we had a very dysfunctional police department that was in charge of the investigation.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden there's a defendant and a suspect, and I hope he did it, because I'd love to see that case resolved, but
Someone called into
we'll
account.
see.
Yeah. Let's just talk about you for a sec. How first of all, you're a qualified lawyer. You've also did a degree in behavioural science, and you've been working in journalism for over 3 decades. What got you there? What took you to journalism in the first place? Were you going to be a lawyer, or did you just lose your way, or what happened?
No, no, no. It's a stupid reason. I always wanted to practice law.
Okay.
I grew up, my father was a lawyer and then a judge. And I always joke I was his only son. He had 4 daughters and I was the only one who wanted to go to law school. And I had watched Perry Mason growing up.
It's good motivation. Yeah.
And I thought, wow, of course, Perry Mason gave you the idea that as soon as you put someone on the stand, they'll go, yes, I did it. But anyway, I wanted to practice law. I did not want to practice criminal law. I wanted to be a litigator and I wanted to do civil law. And so I went to law school and I started with a law firm. And I was the only woman, because if I've been doing journalism for a while, it was a while ago since I went to law school. And I grew up in the Midwest, the very center of the United States. And it was not progressive for female lawyers.
Yeah.
So I had this harebrained idea. I was practicing law, actually, that I was going to audition for a television show. I did not have a degree in journalism. And I thought that if I went on television for a year, people would, why did I think this? But they would look at me. I was going to anchor a show and tell stories, and I was going to do some legal stories. And I thought people then would look at me as a lawyer and I would get work. I didn't realize.
Good plan.
It's a little harebrained, but I was in my 20s. In my defense, I was in my 20s. And so I thought, what a great idea. But what I didn't expect was how much I would love storytelling.
Yeah.
And initially, I didn't leave the law firm right away, but when I did, there were, mostly males who were upset with me because they thought I wanted a more glamorous life than practicing law. And maybe there was some truth to that. But I really think what I liked was the storytelling. And I have learned over the years, and what kept me in this, because every once in a while I'd sit through a trial and feel a pang that I was not practicing law, that I was not the litigator in that case. But I think what it kept me going with that is I felt that I could accomplish more as a journalist than I could as a lawyer in making a difference in people's lives, in informing jurors. I honestly think that our job, our secondary job, beyond entertaining listeners and viewers, we're training people to be better jurors. They will go in the courtroom and they will say, really, is that all the evidence you have? Sometimes that's not good, because sometimes they see these television shows where a murder is resolved in an hour, and they fingerprint comes right up and it's that guy, and they think technology should be there. So they're tough on the prosecutor. But I think if a juror is going to be tough on a prosecutor, that's who that
Yeah.
jurors should be tough on rather than the defense if we really believe in innocent until proven guilty. I
And
don't really think we do believe that, but I do think that's yours. My job
yeah.
is to let people know that the system doesn't always work.
Yeah, I think it's most important. A couple of things in what you said there too, and I found this after leaving the police. And I left in controversial circumstances. If
I know, I read about that too.
and I'm not ashamed in any way of what I did. So I'm not going to fall on my sword and say I shouldn't do it. I recorded a conversation on my phone in a house that had listening devices. Well. But anyway,
but not one that was on the search warrant.
Not on the search warrant, but we have legislation over here. This. I want you on here talking about wrongful convictions. Anyway, I digress. As you can see, I've got over it. But since I've left the police, all jokes aside, like I was taken away, I was in the thick of homicide. I'd been the week that I left the police, or when my career came to an end. I'd been called out, 2 police officers had been shot, been called to a murder. I was living the life of a homicide detective. That was my passion. And that was taken away. And I'm thinking, well, how can I make a difference now? So I dusted myself off. But what I've found, and getting back to the point that you made, as distinct from being a lawyer or working in journalism, what I'm doing now, I think I'm perhaps making a bigger impact on crime than I could have ever, because I'm opening people's eyes up to crime is not all black and white. There's 360-degree view of it. We get a lot of the people I used to lock up back here on the podcast, and it's interesting hearing their perspective. So I do get what you're saying, and educating people on crime. I think gone are the days where if a police officer in the witness box and says this, well, you just accept that as fact. We do need police to be scrutinised. There's some very good police, but there's some very bad police as well. So, yeah, I like what you take on it, what you're doing there in the media, and it is an important role.
I really think we do make a difference. I can give you an example. Back in 2005, I did a wrongful conviction of now I know. I never know in the beginning. Somebody will tell us they're innocent and there'll be evidence that indicates maybe they're innocent. But there was a young man who was charged and convicted of murdering his parents. He was the only one left alive in the home, where 2 of them were bludgeoned and stabbed to death. And when the police that very day took him out, they were convinced he did it because he was the only one left alive and he would inherit everything. Of course, if they had spent a couple more days looking, they would have realized he didn't inherit anything till he was 25 and he's only 17 at this point.
Yep.
And so that really didn't make sense. But anyway, so they kept after him. He was in a room with them and they kept saying, "We know you did it, we know." And so then they play a joke on him. They say, "We just called the hospital and your dad came out of his coma," because he did linger for a little bit. And he said, "You're the one who did it." And so Marty said, "Could I have done it? Oh my God, my dad wouldn't lie. I mean, could I have?" Well, it was over then, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
So when I first did the story, viewers said to me, they'd write me and they'd go, "No way, he's guilty, because you could never get me to admit something I didn't do."
Yeah.
But then 10 years later, after doing stories that involve coerced confessions, and I should point out, his name's Marty Tankleff, did walk out of prison. His parents were likely killed by hitmen hired by his dad's business partner, but be that as it may.
Yeah.
Yes. So it was a great story. But 10 years later, I do a story with a young woman who is cognitively challenged. And she's accused of killing a baby. She's a daycare worker, and she's accused of hitting the baby. She had no history of any kind of anger. And this child actually had a previous head injury, but they put her in a room 9 hours with these 2 cops. You know how her back is. You know what they do, and they use the Reed technique. Good cop and bad cop, and first say, "Oh, don't worry, we just want to know the truth. We just want to know the truth," and then every little bit she gives them. But in the end, we have that whole. Luckily, they taped it, and so I showed it to viewers, and we had experts look at it. And then people were saying, oh my God, Melissa was coerced into saying that. And that was just, I mean, 10 years is
Yeah.
10 years, but all of a sudden, I I could tell there was a difference in people listening and watching, and they had learned something, and they had questions about whether all confessions are truly confessions.
Yeah, those confessions, and I watch with interest the type that come out in America. We've got safeguards that have been put in place, and I think it probably goes back about 20 years, again, following English law, but time in custody, and we have a lot of rules in place. In America, is my understanding, and you said they played a joke that, the father's woken up and said it is you. Over here, it's very strict. You can't make an untrue representation. So I can't say, Erin, we know it was you that broke into the house because we've got your fingerprints in there. And you go, oh, you're right. You've got me. And I go, well, we didn't even actually have your fingerprints. We can't make that untrue representation. That's not necessarily the case in America. You can you get
Oh,
more.
oh, you absolutely can. I mean, the Supreme Court, even there was a case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Yes. And there's a real push to stop that, particularly when you're dealing with defendants who are children or who have any kind of cognitive
Yeah,
issues, because that is when it's likely to happen. There was a case, luckily, the judge saw it, and so the defendant never actually went to prison, although
yeah,
he did go to jail. He was pretrial
yeah,
detained, but he had a history of alcohol, and he would have blackouts. And so he was living in an apartment, and the woman next door was killed. And the police said, we know it's you. We have your blood and your fingerprints. And he goes, they said, you must have blacked out. And he said, then I did it.
yeah. So
And
that's
but he didn't do it. They didn't have any of that. And luckily in that case, the judge threw it out, but it is legal in the United
Yeah,
States to do that.
and I find that I really, because I know how much pressure you can apply on someone in an interview room. You shut those doors and you've got, good cop, bad cop, whatever you want. You can apply pressure, and sadly, it's the people that are probably disadvantaged for 1,000 different reasons are the ones that are vulnerable to that type of thing. But I can see why there would be wrongful convictions, because if you leave someone in a room long enough with people, you can virtually get them to confess to anything. You've always got to be careful if you get a confession. I've had confessions to murders, and then we double check and go, oh well, no, the person actually didn't do it. So I can see how many problems that would exist with that coercive confession.
Well, yes, because like in the case of Marty Tankleff, the one I told you where he's in there and they're saying your dad said you did it. Well, the kind of problem with that was they did that in a day. And so then when another suspect came up,
Yeah,
including his dad's business partner, what can the officers do? They're in their own bind that they created, because if they say, oh, we better look at this guy, then they have to admit there was something wrong with that
yeah,
confession they took. So unfortunately, this was Suffolk County Police Department in New York, and they decided they'd just stick with Marty. So Marty spent 17 years in prison for something that at least a court of appeals says the evidence doesn't exist. And, even that it went that far, because here's another problem. He makes this quote unquote confession. It doesn't match the evidence at the scene. That should have been a huge red light to these
yeah. And the detectives do have a responsibility, and we're focusing on ones that have made mistakes. But I've seen some good detectives, as I'm sure you have, and seen some bad ones that don't. I think you got to have that moral compass. I say a moral compass, and people go, "Oh, who's this bloke? Ex cop, blah blah blah." You really have, because you have got a lot of power as a detective when you've got people in an interview room, and you've got to be careful with it. Where all our confessions now have to be recorded, so it's got to be recorded
That's
if there's
great.
a confession, and that changed the landscape. The old school policing thought the sky's going to fall. What we're not allowed to speak to them off camera. So any confession now in this in our jurisdiction it's got to be recorded on video, and I think that's fairer. And the world hasn't changed. We're still locking up the bad guys where need be, but it's those safeguards that are in place. So, but
Yeah, I would think
yeah,
most of the time, I mean, look, we do focus on the stories that are interesting. And so sometimes they're going to show where the investigation went off the rails.
yeah,
But the truth is, all these cases we don't hear about are ones that operated the way they should.
yeah,
Good investigative work. I mean, one of the stories I featured in this podcast I did it because both the prosecutor and the cops in this case knew who had killed this young woman, and they were determined to find the evidence. There were twins who
yep,
had decided to commit the perfect murder. And so they watched a number of crime shows, so they knew what to do. They would only hit the victim once, so there was no blood spatter. They wore plastic so they wouldn't leave any DNA. But in the end, it was just really good police work and
yep,
noticing which of these twins might be the weaker and getting him to finally turn on his brother. And not only did he turn on his brother, but he actually on video describes exactly how they killed her. And I thought that was a good case because it was really good police, patient
yeah.
and accurate police work.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, if they learnt their how to commit a crime watching TV, I always say I don't want to give people tips, but the hardest murders to solve is where it's one person who hasn't told anyone. That's if I know there's more than one offender in there, you're always in with a chance. It's the one if someone's committed a murder and they say nothing, they're the hardest ones to prove. Difficult. No, I won't tell because I'll give people ideas. I was going to say.
I know we have to be careful at times. There's one method that has actually come up a couple of times in cases, and I actually had a doctor say, "Look, I will talk to you about this particular method, but I'm not going to show how anyone could do it." Because it's just so easy. It could give people ideas. And I have to be honest, I just recently ran into a similar case. So it's an effective way to kill someone and hard to detect by medical examiners. So we never went into great detail.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll for the safety of the public, we're not going to take this any further. Now, I Catch Killers, and that's the name of this podcast, and My Life of Crime, your podcast. So we're going to dig deep into the crime world. Obviously, mass shootings. One thing that America, we look over here, and one thing that we identify with is the mass shootings over in America, and every time it happens, we go, "What the hell? Is someone going to do something about this? How does it happen time and time again?" What's your take on the situation over there? Because we had one mass shoot, or we've had a couple of mass shootings, but on a scale was the Port Arthur massacre where 35 people were killed. I think that was back in 1996. On the basis of that, the gun control thing, we just took guns off everyone. We had a gun buyback scheme. People would be bringing their guns into the police station. We'd be paying them to get guns off the street. Really changed the landscape, and I think saved a lot of people down the track. In America, it's just one thing after another. What's your take?
Well, that's a very, very difficult one. No question. When you talked earlier about how sometimes politicians will say you've got to move on, a very common thing you'll hear right after a terrible mass shooting in the United States is, "It's not time for politics, it's time for prayers."
Yeah.
I don't think that helps the victims.
No.
I don't quite understand as someone, I mean, sometimes I feel that unless you've been on the scene of one of these, you can't really, even when we show the pictures on TV, you really can't comprehend how awful they are. I don't quite understand why, we have people who can obtain magazines that contain more ammunition than the cops are allowed to carry. we have these guns that have no use for hunting, but can quickly kill people in a very, very short, brutal period of time. And it's astounding to me after particularly the school shootings. There was one in Connecticut where I could not cover it. It's the first story I did one day and I could not do any more. I was crying through interviews and it was unprofessional, but I could
Which one
not
was that?
imagine.
Which one was that, Erin?
Newtown, Newtown.
Right, okay. Was that is that Sandy Hook?
Yeah, Sandy Hook,
Right,
same,
okay.
yeah, Sandy Hook or Newtown. And,
That was
you had
where it
this
was the
young
kids.
man who then, he kills his mother first and then he kills these children who are all just little children and their parents who have to live with the fact, they couldn't protect their kids. And then you had that awful radio Jones who would then say it was all made up. They're actors. None of this really happened. So that added pain. But I honestly thought when that happened that we would, as a country, realize that, nobody, at least I certainly would not want to take people's guns away, but I think there are ways that you can make it more difficult for somebody who is really suicidal, as you know.
Yeah.
Most of these cases, Gary, they are, and they just don't want to go alone. They want to take people with them. It's usually individuals who have mental illness. It's often young men. It's rare for young women to do it, and yet we just don't seem willing. I mean, I know this country, and it was founded on people came to the United States because they wanted rights. They wanted land. They did not want a government telling them and ruling every aspect of their lives. And that is the basis. That's what this country was started. And I think there's still so much of that in this country. But it just, unless I did do Columbine, and then I started on Sandy Hook, Newtown, and I could not continue. I just I couldn't do it.
The limit of what you can absorb. I can't even. I can't, and I've seen horrific crime scenes, but I can't comprehend something on that magnitude. And when it's children involved like that too, it must just be heartbreaking. But I lost faith in the system over there changing something just to stop these situations happening after that, because I thought if that doesn't change things, nothing will. And
well, there have been Parkland. There have been. I don't know what it will take. The idea that you can't go to a 4th of July parade without worrying about somebody deciding to, just shoot indiscriminately.
Yeah.
And I don't understand that at all. It would be much harder to have these mass killings if you just didn't have these guns that are so easily used.
Well, the assault
let off so many shots in such a short period of time.
I did tactical policing. They're assault rifles. They're assault rifles for a reason, because you can just let off round after round, and I can't see the justification. Right to bear arms. That was born back a long time ago. I think it's changed a little bit. What if the guns get even better? Do something that can shoot 1,000 like you see on the gunships in the military. Do we allow people to have those? Like it's
and now you can make your own guns. Now that you can actually create guns at home, basically, if you have the right equipment that don't have any serial numbers.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very worrisome. And I think with how divided this country is, and this is a very this is actually a world issue where I think people are really divided about what they want their future to be. I think it's just scary to have people who might be really unhappy and have some mental illness have access to a very powerful weapon.
Well, you touch on something there with the mental illness. If that factors in, if they've got access to firearms, that's when you get the situation like this. Otherwise, it might be one person or whatever before the authorities can step in. But it's quite sad. Erin, we might take a break now, just a short break, and when we come back for part two, we're going to keep digging deep into your world, which is fascinating. I reckon I could speak to you for hours. But we'll come back and we're going to talk about a couple of other cases that you worked, and I want to get your thoughts on the role of the media and policing and all sorts of things. So let's just take a short break and we'll be back for part two.